All right, welcome back. We are MDEV1001. That's Mobile Data Management in the summer 2023 semester at Georgian, and it's week 13, part 2 of our broadcast and recording. And in this part, we just finished talking about assignments and tests and positive things, mostly, and some weird stuff. And now we're going to be talking about Firebase authentication, right? And what is this thing that we're asking you to do? Well, I mean, we're talking about Firebase has been around for a long time, like I mentioned last week. It's not something that's new, okay? So if you actually look at the videos for Firebase that are up there, they're like, some of them are like 10 years old, all right? But it doesn't matter. One of the things that hasn't changed a lot is Firebase auth, right? What's changed a lot is Firestore, real-time database, and a bunch of other stuff. But Firebase authentication is like the same as it's been for years and years and years, because they made it really good back then, and it's still good now, right? And so that's something that that is up there. So what is it? It provides a secure user sign-in. Honestly, I like Firebase authentication more than almost any other type of authentication you can do. It's really great for games, for all kinds of platforms. It's super simple to implement on the web, whether it's on iOS or Android. It's probably like the first simplest thing they could have done. And it's super useful. Like, they made it like really work well, right, compared to everything else. So that's something. It's like what it says easily integrates with other Firebase services. It's absolutely true, right? And really good, robust security options. Some key features we want to talk about. It has a great pre-built, this is new, this is the one part that's new, UI library that you can tap into. And that means like literally no code, and it'll give you user interface elements that'll pop up inside of your app, whether it's on the web or in Android or iOS, and it'll look identical. Like it is like a microservice, almost like that good, right? So it's really, really good. And it's fully customizable, and it's literally zero code and ready to go. Like, that's how good it is, right? So if you wanted to go with that, you could have. We're not going to. But that's something to explore, especially for someone who likes low code, no code. Like if you're a developer, but you're not a app developer, you're a designer and you want to make an app, and you've kind of put together a front end, and instead of putting a back end, Firebase is your answer. It's really great, okay? Lots of language support. It does account linking, which is really cool. It'll link up all your accounts, which is great. Same email address, multiple accounts. It'll kind of work great. It does monitoring and analytics for you. And from a security standpoint perspective, it uses bcrypt, which is what we would be using if we were on the web anyway, right? Which is great, so standard stuff. It supports multi-factor authentication. Again, even easier than stuff that we just did on the web, for you guys. OAuth 2 is built in. Which is and OpenID Connect. So it's got everything you can possibly think of from a service to make it secure. And there's lots of authentication strategies. And here's an example of some. So there's email password authentication strategy. There's a phone number authentication strategy. Anonymous, if you don't want to get your user to do anything, right? Social media providers so this is OAuth using Google and Apple, Facebook, GitHub. These are all the new ones. The one that your Google Play will be up there. Twitter, which you changed to X, that hasn't changed up on Firebase yet. It will. And others, all for free. Okay. And custom providers you can configure, but there's a bit of a cost. But I have to mention there's a challenge, because our app uses username and password, and they don't support username and password out of the box. And the reason for this is because, I kind of mentioned this before, username and password is not best practices anymore, right? Even though it's very common. It's more original when there's only one email address that your user is ever going to have, right? There's also a built-in verification component that's with an email address that doesn't exist with the username, right? So now, I'm not saying it couldn't be done, and we're going to talk about a workaround, because we don't want to work hard, right? We want to use our existing existing setup, existing UI, right? So how do we do that? Well, here's the workaround. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to use email and password to register our user, but it's going to be in the background. It's going to be transparent to the user, right? They're going to fill up a registration form like they normally would, right? And when they fill up the registration form, we're going to use Firestore to store the username and email address. We're going to create a mapping between the two, a one-to-one map, right? So we'll have a usernames collection on Firestore, and for each username, we'll have one email. That's how we're going to get around it. When you register, you map the username, you save the username in Firestore, and when you log in, you search for the username, and if it's found, then you do your comparison on authentication. Okay, so this way it's transparent because it's the exact same thing we've been doing this entire semester, and this way I don't have to come up with a brand new UI for today. All right? That's why we're doing it this way. But you don't have to. If you really want to, you could use like built-in elements that they'll give you, similar to when you're doing something like Stripe Authentic, like payments, the same idea. That's what Firebase will give you. But we're not going to do that. Does that make sense? So again, we're going to get around it, and the way we're going to get around it is we're going to use Firestore. Okay? You could have also used real-time database for this. So if you had a real-time database instead of Firestore, we could have done that too. But why? I'm not going to set up a whole other database just for usernames. That doesn't make sense. All right. So today's in-class exercise goals. Working with a copy of last week's in-class exercise, we'll convert our authentication strategy to work with Firebase. We'll use our previous login and register screens to connect to Firebase authentication. This normally uses email and password, but out of the box, but we will need a little workaround we just talked about. And for you to do, same as last time, we're going to duplicate this next set of code to make it work with Android. So if last week you made your Android app work, you just need to now make your Android app work with authentication. And it'll be slightly different, but again, this didn't take me a long time to do, and it shouldn't take you a long time to do as well. So let's get right into it and talk about how it was done and what I did. So here we are in the Mac Studio. I'm just going to make this maximize now, and we'll take a look at the code. Now, there is something that I haven't changed. I haven't changed the naming convention from my API login view controller or my API register view controller, and I'm going to do that here because some people have come up and asked me questions like, I don't know how to rename stuff. It doesn't work for me. Can you help me? So I've got email just last week about it. So I mean, in my opinion, this is one of those questions that you can ask, like almost like, how do I use GitHub to put to make a commit? All right, this is weeks old now, guys. You should know how to do this kind of stuff. But it wasn't just one person, which means A, it's either somehow a hole in your knowledge. I don't know how it's a hole. Maybe you didn't watch the video or whatever. So what do? How do I rename the API register view controller? Let's do the first thing first. Let's do this. How do I do that? You guys are here. Help me out. How do I rename it? What's the right way to do it? Yes?
You can right-click and give an option, or there's an identity and type there.
Yep. There's so many things. There's a bunch of ways. I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to go right-click. Instead of doing this way, I'm going to right-click over here, and I'm going to go, let's see, oh yeah, this is a new thing.
That's the new thing I learned.
I'm just getting a lot of lag today.
Name from right-clicking it and it changes everywhere.
So again, I'm going to go to refactor rename. And when I refactor rename, it'll actually ask me what I want to rename it. I'm not going to name it API. That doesn't make sense. But maybe what I want to do is call it something like, Firebase. Like that might make sense, right? So again, I'm going to click in here and I'm going to just rename this thing to Firebase Register View Controller so that we know it's for today. Okay, Firebase Register View Controller. Okay, and everything changes. The file name changes. Okay, there's a couple things we need to change outside of the file name, which people asked about. The other one is API login view controller. By the way, you can download this whole application. It's already up on GitHub, right? I did it this way this week because the change is so slight. It's just easier for me to show it to you this way. I'll go through the code with you as opposed to getting you to construct a whole new app, which doesn't make any sense because there's not a lot of changes here for me to get you to construct a whole new app. Again, the same thing goes here. Again, there's just a design choice for today. Right click, and I'm just going to go refactor, rename for the API login view controller, and I'm going to do the exact same thing. So I'm going to go in here and just change the name here, where the name is going to change to Firebase. Just so we know what it is, Firebase login view controller. Okay? And so everything is Firebase. And now we're not done, right? Once you've named the view controllers, the right thing to do is, if you're going to rename your project so that it looks proper, is go into your main storyboard and make sure that when we click over here, it doesn't say wrong stuff, like here, right? Here's an example where it says API. Why? Because I've changed my storyboard ID over here to say that. So just make sure it changed here. And there's one other place. So Firebase, it's got to say that there. And it's also got to say it here, right? Because that's what I've done. I've just made sure that I've controlled everything. There we go. So now it actually says Firebase register view controller. I'll do the same thing for the login view controller, where I'm going to go here and change the login Firebase instead of API. Will you have to do this for next week? I mean, maybe. That's the question I always get. Do I have to rename stuff? I'll try and give you a starter project, or I might name a starter project that I get you to start with. I might say, using in-class exercise number blah blah, start off with this. And I might say something like, using this is mandatory. Mandatory. You need to do it. You can't start with the random stuff. And I'll give you a list of in-class exercise that you can use from my GitHub repository. So they're done. So it's not like you're going to start off with it and go, well, I don't have this done, Tom. Well, here it is. Okay? In a future iteration of this course, what I'd like to do is make both. Like I'll have both the Android side and the iOS side, and it'll be like an ABC kind of thing. And even maybe the React Native stuff. I don't know if I have time, right? But and this way you've seen all the different examples across all platforms. But you should be able to do that on your own. Okay, so this is the way it works. Let's run this thing and see what happens. Whenever we make changes like this, I want to show you how it works right now. So take a look. This is what I've given you. Yeah, there's some changes to the user interface a little bit here too. And you may want to use in-class exercise 12 user interface for your final test next week. Here's why, right? And this is not back-end specific, by the way. If I log in, so I put in my username, in this case mine is Thomas, and I start putting in my password, but I forgot what it is. Well, the nifty thing is to have this little I right here, right at the right. So I've added it in. And so if I click on the I, you can see the password. And if you click off, it notices red. And if I click off it, it goes blue, right? And I've added that is because that's a very common thing you might see nowadays with common apps. And I didn't want to leave you not being with you after this and never showing you something like this because it's so common, right? So that's what I'm doing here, and you can see that that's how this works. If I log in properly to demonstrate that it logs in, then we should be able to log in and you should see this. And this connects back into the Firebase stuff. It looks identical to what we had last week. No difference. So the last week's stuff hasn't been touched, your list and your add edit screen. It's just the login and the register screens that have been modified, okay? The login screen mostly. Register, almost zero modification, okay? And let's talk about this stuff. So I've modified a little bit of it, but actually the modification is not drag and drop, it's programmatic. I would have liked, again, if I was teaching you the iOS or Android stuff, I would like to do more programmatic stuff with you, right? Programmatic user interface as opposed to just drag and drop. Sometimes it makes sense. It behooves us to use programmatic interface like this, which is what I did, all right? So I'll talk about how it was done. First, let's start off with the register screen because that's the main screen that we have to talk about. So let's go into our Firebase register view controller. Oh, by the way, before we move on, let's go to Visual Studio Code and add all this up. right? So I'm going to say git add dot git commit minus m, and we'll say renamed view controllers. Okay. So now your Visual Studio, your Visual Studio Code has updated your GitHub repository. Okay. So to show you this, right? If you look at the GitHub repository that's up here, let's take a look. So if I go to GitHub, and if I go to Georgian, you can see that this is your ICE right here, and ICE 12 is actually up here. Here it is. And there's your renamed view controllers. So this is like the version I'm just working on right now. You have it already. It's done. All right. What you need to do is recreate it for yourself, right? So go with last week's, kind of starting off with last week's ICE 11, make a copy, change the names, all those kind of things. One thing I have to put up my hand and say, if you're going to use the same Firebase backend, please do not change the bundle. The bundle identifier should stay the same. It should still be ICE 11. Let me explain, right? So if I go to Firebase, when you're doing this week's front end, it's the exact same as last week, right? But if we went to ICE 11, you can see that, and if I go to configuration for ICE 11, let's say project settings, right, then you can see here in ICE 11 that the bundle identifier, the project ID, right, is ICE 11, and the bundle identifier is also ICE 11, okay? So this is something that you need to consider when you put this together, when you copy your app. You don't want to make a new bundle identifier, right? Notice that when it comes down, it tells you that here's my SDK setup, and notice that my app nickname and my bundle identifier are the things that it's looking for. Now, could I change this right now? Not easily is the answer, right? This bundle identifier, notice there's not a little pen next to it, which means I can't change the bundle identifier. Now, I made it for ICE 11 last week, and I don't want to make a whole brand new app and do that crazy trick by importing and all that stuff. That makes no sense, right? I don't want to use that app ever again in my life, right? So that's why, I kind of, I've given it to you like this. And so that's one thing that you have to make sure of. So how do we keep this the same? Well, if we go back to Xcode, when I did my copy, then up here in the manifest, you can see that the bundle identifier is at number 11. All right, so if you're going to copy paste and make a copy of your stuff, that part you need to change back or leave at 11, because it was already 11 last week. I mean, there's nothing for you to do. Just don't overwrite it with 12. That's all. Otherwise, it'll give you weird errors and it won't work. Okay, so that's the one thing you need to watch. Okay, when you make your copy for Firebase. Unless you are ambitious and you want to make a brand new project backend with Firebase and re-import all your data and all that kind of stuff, that's on you. Okay. Couple things that I want you not to do. Some people, for whatever reason, think it's okay to download my entire app and use my bundle identifier. And if you did that for your in-class exercise 11, you're going to get 0. Okay. That is 100% not the exercise. You need to set up your own backend for Firebase. And the same goes with your assignment 4. Please use a completely different backend than your in-class exercise, which means you have to make a brand new thing, and you have some work to do, right? And it should have its own unique identifier, which is assignment 4, not in-class exercise 11. So if I see it, if you hand in your assignment 4 and it says in-class exercise 11, or if somehow weirdly you use mine or whatever, you'll just get 0. There won't even be like a minus, it'll be 0. All right, so please don't do that. Okay, so so that's something that you need to do. Make sure your app is your own app, not my app. This is your own backend. This is Firebase. Part of the learning is understanding how to put together your backend and registering for Firebase yourself. Okay. So back to this. So that's why I pointed this out. So now what about authentication? Normally it's under build. Under build, there is an authentication piece here. And when you click onto authentication, you need to activate it. And one of the ways to activate is when you go to sign-in method. I have activated my email provider. That's what I did. But when you say add new provider, you can see that there's many other types of providers here. You need to sub in and add in email password and check on the enabled it's going to look something like this. When I go to phone, right, you'll have an enable switch like this enable switch. But this enable switch won't be on the phone side. It'll be here on the email side, email password. So you need to turn that on. Okay, that's the only one you need to turn on. Once you turn it on, your email and password is created. Then what you're going to get is users, and the users is what you're going to see here under users is any users that's been created. Here you can see that. I'm just going to make this bigger. Maybe I can make it bigger so you can see it a little larger. You can see here that Tom Smith is a user I made, right? Tom Smith, Tom Sidiopoulos, too big, right? And so I made it today. So here's an example of this, and you can see that it's got a user ID, and the provider is email. You can see the provider is right there. That is the way it's been made, okay? You can also add a user here instead of doing it online, right? So one thing is you'll get the identifier for the user, which is what you need. And if I go over here and if I say copy, I can do that. And if I go here, I can't enable or edit, but I can reset the password if I really want to, okay? Resetting the password is not going to help you because there's no way of you having to reset the password. We haven't created user interfaces like that. You have to make another user interface to reset the password. We don't have that, okay? So please don't do that. Just delete it. Delete the account and do it over if you don't know how to do it, right? And here you can see that you can change the password hash parameters. We're not going to do that here, okay? So that I'm just showing you what users looks like. Sign-in method is what you really want to focus on, which is your providers. And like I said, we're using email and password. That is the one that you want to use. That's this one. Okay, that's your provider, the native provider that you want to use. Okay. Other ones you can see that are very popular here are the additional providers, which are the social media providers here. Like, for example, GitHub. Again, for GitHub, you'd enable it, and then you go to your client ID and your client secret, and it'll tell you some information under Learn More about how to do that, right? Where you basically register all that information. You have to almost like register an API key for GitHub, that you're going to be using GitHub as a provider. And then once you've registered your API key for your app, then every single time you connect with GitHub to use OAuth, which is third-party authentication, then it would use that same client secret and all that stuff that you're going to have here. Okay, so setting it up with GitHub or Google or whatever provider is super easy, and whichever providers you set up, if you ever wanted to make use of their built-in interfaces, then it'll show up with all the providers you select when it comes to registering. Register with GitHub, register with whatever, right? And it'll go through that whole step and nothing for you to do. It just does it all for you. Okay, that's how easy it is. So that's templates. You can also go to templates. They have some templates you can use here for email address verification. If you really want to, it talks about how to use this, and it even gives you a little email that you can send off, which is what it's going to look like. Verify your email for your app name, whatever this thing is called, and da-da-da-da, right? And it also does how to do a password reset. It talks about how to do that, and it says when a user forgets their password, you can do a password reset. Email address change. What if they want to change their email address? If they want to use multi-factor authentication enrollment or even SMTP settings, you can do all of that here, and SMS verification is here too. So some really great templates they give you. They talk about, you can see, kind of usage. You can see it's very simple. There's no usage for me right now. And some settings. And some settings that you can set up are linking accounts that use the same email, or you can create multiple accounts, one for each identity. It's up to you. I use linking, so that way if I kind of submitted more than one user with the same email, it'd be the same. It'd be the same user. Now, if we allowed that, here's something that's going to happen. On our back-end workaround, that might mess us up, right? Because we're doing a mapping, right? But it would still work, just weird, right? And other things here. We can set up things like authorized domains and the regional policies and so on. But for the most part, you can see that there's not a big dashboard. Not a big dashboard means simple to install, right? And we're going to look at the I want to look at the, kind of the documentation here. So if I go to Firebase, up to Firebase for a second again, and if I look at docs, and if I look at build, and then you can see on the left, let me just make this bigger for you so you can see it better in my demo. There we go. Then you can see authentication is here. Right here's authentication. And then it says, well, here's an intro, and where do I start? And all that kind of stuff. It talks about how to do that. So intro has the intro video from 7 years ago, right? And that kind of stuff. It talks about how to get started and all the, solutions. It asks you where to start, and, it even gives you examples about how to sign in with a pre-built UI. So here's an example of this. So this is what it would look like with a pre-built UI, right? Sign in with Google, sign in with whatever you chose or you made available for your users. Now, you as a developer would have to register for Google API, an API key. You'd have to do GitHub or whatever you want to provide your users with. I would recommend do the stuff that you're comfortable with. I'd probably use nowadays GitHub, especially if you have people who code. Then GitHub makes sense, right? But definitely Microsoft, I would put up, Google, and Apple. If you did those three, you're covering like everybody, right? Because everyone's got a Microsoft, a Google, or an Apple account, one of those, right? And GitHub will just be if you want to really do something with and there's also the last one, which is sign in with email or sign up with your phone. Right, you can actually do SMS signups and stuff like that, which is really cool. So there's really great options here. And what the Firebase UI does is it kind of gives you a way of incorporating this stuff right away. Now, one problem with this is it says you want to add Firebase to your Apple project, and it talks about how to do that here. We've already done that. We've already added Firebase to our project. And so one thing that you have to note is that we've almost done everything. The only thing we haven't done is we haven't done UI, and it looks like we have to use CocoaPods for this, right? Not sure if that's the case here, but I remember when we did this, I did this way long ago, and it was CocoaPods. CocoaPods sucks. I don't like it. Yeah, that's just me, right? So hopefully not. So we can look it up if you really care, but this is one way of doing it. Then afterwards, it talks about Swift. It doesn't even give you a Swift UI option, which is interesting. And then you can see that it gives you instructions on how to get this done. Okay, and really what you're doing is you're using a Firebase UI OAuth, which is the FUI OAuth thing. That's Firebase UI OAuth. And what you're doing is you're using whatever the provider that you want to use. Apple auth provider, and then what it'll do is it'll set up this for all your kind of things that you're doing. There's the Facebook auth provider, and there's whatever you're going to do, and Twitter and whatever. I wouldn't use Twitter nowadays. It's going to be honest, right? Because you don't know what's going to change. It's going to change tomorrow to X or something else, right? I don't know what it's going to look like on the back end. So I'd recommend something that you use a lot. Facebook even is weird, right? So I probably wouldn't use Facebook these days because some people don't use Facebook. Instagram, maybe, if that was available, right? And I don't know if it is. I don't think that was an option, right, for us to log in. Let me see. Sign-in method. Nope. That's not an additional provider that's available. These are the ones. So I probably wouldn't use Facebook. I would use Google. I would use Microsoft, those for sure, and I would use Apple, those three. Absolutely, and maybe GitHub as a third, right? I'm surprised they don't also have LinkedIn, which is also a popular, kind of sign-up choice. But definitely not Game Center, Play Games, Facebook, or Twitter. I wouldn't use that, and it's not Yahoo. I don't know who uses Yahoo anymore, right? I would just give the ones that you think are most common, and I'm telling you, I probably want to use those, right? Phone authentication is okay. Not a lot of people do that. And anonymous authentication, sometimes you want to do that if you just want someone to identify. You want nothing to do with you don't want to know who it is. They want it, for example, you're making some kind of app that is used for surveys. Like you get them to log into your app and do a survey, and they log in anonymously. So they log in with their credentials, but you never see their credentials. That's a good idea, right? And that's where that use case is. But notice how custom providers, I can't do it, and it says upgrade. They've never had that before. I mean, way back, they've started to add these little things in there to, like, you could use all of the features of Firebase once upon a time, and now they've added features you can't do anymore, right? So that's interesting. Okay, especially things like multi-factor, SMS multi-factor authentication. That's an upgrade, right? So that makes sense, right? All right, so that is the back end. Notice now I have authentication as a build and Firebase Firestore. When I logged in, it created, when I go to Firebase Firestore, you can see now that I have a separate collection called usernames. And I only have one username, right? And this is my mapping, my username to email mapping. Now, okay, so this is one thing that you might think, which is, well, okay, but this is clear text, right? And I'm storing authentication information in clear text. And so there's things you could do to stop that, right? You could encrypt stuff. You can create an encryption algorithm to encrypt both the username and the password if you really want to, or sorry, the email. There's no password, it's email. The password has nothing to do with you. You have no access to the password. But remember, even if you did things in Mongo, you'd see the username. Mongo doesn't encrypt the username either, right? So in this case, I don't see that there's a big risk. One thing is you want to limit in your access. There's an access list. Remember at the beginning where you set it up as a test app? There you have to do some manipulation later on, and you won't do it now. You'd have to look this up. But basically what you have to do is so that make sure that only users from that app have access to this stuff. Like it has to be really limited. And so that no random person can poke around in here or whatever. I mean, probably they won't know how to do it, but if you're really knowledgeable with Firebase and stuff, it would propose a security hole if you didn't kind of shore up your access list, right? So those are the things that you'd probably want to think about from an authentication perspective. Here today, though, this course is not about auth. This course is about, data, right? So we're doing this because I guess it makes sense that we're storing stuff, and I'm showing you the workaround. So this is the example, and I'm going to show you how this works with another user. We're going to make another user today to prove out register. All right, so I'm just showing you that I've already registered one, and this is how it kind of sets up a usernames collection, and it maps the username to the email address. Okay, so that's what this is. Back to our code then. So here's Xcode. So let's talk about this then when it comes to the register controller. Let's take a look at that. So here's my Firebase register controller, and I want to discuss this a little bit. So one is, why did I not have any additional setup? I did all my setup last week. I don't know if you remember, but I went through and I chose auth last week because I knew that this week we're going to do it. If you didn't, then you're going to have to go to add packages again and then modify your packages up here where the package dependencies are here. And notice here in the Firebase dependencies, I already have, kind of the ones that I want. Okay. And I'm just curious, I don't think that it includes UI stuff. So I think you're going to have to use CocoaPods with that, which just is insane. I wouldn't want to use CocoaPods. So if you wanted to do that, kind of built-in UI. But that's all of this stuff for Firebase. So it's all inclusive. It's all good to go. And then in the app delegate, right? In the app delegate, remember last week we put in Firebase Core up here, and we installed the Firebase configuration app right here. You needed to do that part of your configuration settings last week, and we've already done that, so we don't have to do it again. Firebase app configuration is a one-time deal, which means making authentication work this week was super easy because I don't have to do any of that stuff that we did last week, okay? So back to our Firebase register view controller. At the top, you can see that I'm using two libraries. One of them is the Firestore library and the auth library, and I need to use both of them because of my workaround. I wouldn't have to do this if I was just using Firebase auth the way it was meant to be used with just email, and password. And then you're okay, right? We're still okay. I'm just telling you, I wanted to not change my user interface at all, right? I didn't want to say my login screen, email please. Put in your email and then log in. I didn't want that. I wanted to put in my username, right? Which is what we often see. So this is all the same. Nothing has changed here. Here's where things change. And you can see that the code is much reduced actually, right? Because there's not a lot of code here. Look, I'm going to say something like this. Auth, hey auth. And auth comes from Firebase auth, right? We didn't have to define it as a separate thing. I'm using the class directly. I'm saying, hey auth, I want you to use the auth method to create a user with an email that's the email address, which is this email address right here, okay? Now, realistically, what we'd want to do is when we confirm password and all that kind of stuff, we may want to confirm email address, right? We haven't done that, like in your form. So that's one, I think, a realistic change you'd want to make with your form, where you make your email address, confirm email address, password, confirm password. And you want both of those things to be confirmed because your email address is your username now, right? And if you mess that up, it's hard to change. I mean, you'd have to have a whole other form to do that, right? So that's one thing. But here we just say basically we're going to take the email address and that's how we're going to create our user. Our password is whatever password we got, and then we're going to get an auth result. And if the auth result is positive, then we're golden. If not, then it's an error. And if it's an error, we're just going to return the error, as an example. Now, one thing I didn't do here is I didn't pop up. We could have also created an error manager thing where it would pop up a message saying that your user's not registered, right? There's a registration problem. You wouldn't tell them why. You're not going to say, oh, that user already exists. No, that's too much information as a security problem. You're just going to say registration failed. You're not going to tell them why, okay? And then after that, we're going to say let database is Firestore. This is kind of what we did last week, right? Where we basically say DB collection usernames. Let's make a new document called username, right? That's what that is, right? And that username is what we're getting, from the username up here. Okay, so that document is just string. That's what the document is, right? And then I'm going to set my data to this structure, which is basically I want to make one property. That's how you set the data for one property to email, right? And then if there's a problem, we can say error writing to document. Otherwise, we can say document successfully written, which is what we've done. And then finally, we print the user register successfully. And then in our dispatch queue, we're going to do a Firebase login view controller. We're going to clear the text fields and go back there because I want you to try it out now and log in. So that's it. I mean, it's really maybe 10 lines of code for us to log in, right? There's not a lot. And that's amazing for all the things that you get. And I really mean that. There's no back end. You don't need an API. It's super secure. And you get this, right? So super easy to register. Okay, how about the login view controller? Is that more complicated? Well, I've complicated it. But for the most part, no. You still need two libraries because, again, we're doing our workaround, right? And I've added this extra noise in here in the view did load because I want the colors to change for two things. I want my border color to change when I'm actually pressing in the field. I want my border color to change. By the way, you could do the same border color changing when you register or edit anything. And if you're doing it every single time, then you might as well make it some kind of helper function or helper class that you're going to have in a separate file to do all your border color changes, right? That's one thing. And here's where I programmatically instantiate a button. So this is new, right? Where I basically said, look, I want to show the password button, and I want to instantiate an object of new UI button. Okay, and we're going to make the type custom. So I make a new custom button. I set the image to that button to an I, that's the system name, and I actually is part of the library. It's already built in. I'm just saying I want to use that I icon, right? By the way, you can do this for other things in your code, not just as an example, just for here. And then once we do that, I can change the tint. I change the tint color to system blue. By the way, always try and use system colors. I'm sure you've been told this already in iOS because of dark mode. If I use system blue or system black or system red or whatever, and then I switch to light mode, it's going to switch the color palettes for you automatically, right? As opposed to if I use my own custom colors, then it won't switch anything. There won't be a blue. There won't be a dark mode and a light mode, right? We want to manage dark mode and light mode by using system colors. System colors will automatically switch for you. All right, and the frame, when we make a frame, basically what it creates is a rectangle that, I kind of define the rectangle of the button. I say this is how big the button is. And I need to use a frame so I can set up, set the image horizontally within that frame, right? And I'm doing this because I don't really have padding in this scenario, right? So I'm basically saying here, this is my frame size. It's going to be 40 by 20, right? And I want to shift the thing so it's on the leftmost edge. But meanwhile, the button itself has a certain size, and it's 30 by 20. 40 by 20 frame, right? If you think about the rectangle, 30 by 20 button, the button is not as wide as the frame, which means if I make it left aligned, it'll appear like there's padding on the right side. It's tricks, right? And that's why I did it that way. I still use the, instead of instantiating an object that is a button and creating a link in different ways, here I'm using that add event listener style of programmatic event listeners, right? And this requires a little bit of Objective-C tagging, right? When I tag a code like this, I'm using a little bit of Objective-C and basically saying, I'm saying this is a low-level call. That's what I'm saying, right? That this toggle password visibility is a handler for my event listener. Here's my event listener. I'm setting up a add target to the button, and the action is my selector. The action that you're using here is basically you're saying, I want you to connect my toggle password visibility function to this event. That's how you do it. For touch up inside. So when I touch up the button itself, I always laugh at touch up inside. I don't know why they use that. It's really weird and sexual. But anyways, then you touch up that button. I know, it's really weird. And then, didn't that ever occur to you? I don't know, when I first learned this, was like, touch up inside. They should change that. That doesn't age well, right? And, but it means that you want to touch the inside of the button instead of touch the outside of the button, or hover. It's like a hover effect, right? You don't want that. And so they give you more usability. It's just a class that they've named. They just need to rename it to something else, okay? Anyway, and then what you do is you get your container view, right? And what you're doing is you're getting a reference to your UI view itself, right? So your container view itself, you're creating a UI view, and then you're adding the subview, which is your show password button. That's what you're doing, right? And what's happening here is you're taking the standard UI view or the super view and you're attaching it on. That's what you're doing. Okay, so then that's interesting and that's great, but then how does it appear inside the button itself? How does it appear in the field? Like, how do we know where this appears? We never said that it's going to appear inside of my password field, right? Does it say it anywhere? Here, all we have, the container view itself, right, is just a UI view. So maybe I'm doing this all in memory right now. The UI view is made in memory. Once I have the UI view in memory, then how do I connect it? That's the thing, right? Because notice that my username text field and my password text field, I'm using something called a delegate. And this is something new because in order for me to do this, I need to use the UI text field delegate in order for me to color the borders, okay, if I'm going to do this properly. And coloring the borders, I can also specify the border width and a bunch of other stuff this is the way you'd have to do it to make sure it works every single time. But with the delegate comes delegate stubs. Notice the delegate stubs are right here, right? So here's a couple of delegate stubs. One of them is text field did begin editing and text field did end editing. I need to do this because I want to capture those events for each text field, right? So I've got two events, one for the username text field and the other one for the password text field. And what I'm trying to capture is when I'm finished editing, I want to change the border color back to gray because I've chosen gray as the default border color, okay? But notice here where my show password button, and I say that equals to the container view subviews dot first as a UI button. So this is where I'm doing it for the first, when I'm toggling password visibility, as an example, I'm saying the password text field is secure entry dot toggle, right, is basically what I'm setting up here, okay? So that's what I'm doing here. When I'm calling this function, toggle password visibility, I'm toggling it. The toggle means I'm going to switch from on to off and from off to on. That's what that does. And then in the container view, for the first time, I say let the container view equals to the password field right view. Okay, so now that means that if I have my entire password field, right, so it's like a big rectangle, right? There's the right view and the left view. Right view is the right side, left view is the left side. All right? And then I'm saying let that equal to the container view that I want. All right? And then the show password button is equal to this container view, and I want to look at the subviews and the first subview, and I want to cast it as a UI button. I'm casting that right side as the UI button, and I'm storing a reference to it in the show password button. And then the show password button tint color I'm changing. So it's always like, this part. This is how I'm doing the toggle. But down here is where we're actually setting up the where it's going to be. So here I'm creating the container view in the button. I'm doing it in memory. And then right here inside of the view did load, I'm taking the right view and I'm making it equal to this container view. I'm actually creating a subview is what I'm doing here. All right? And then it says password text field right view mode is equal to always. This is a toggle that basically I can see the right view. That's all I'm saying. So it's a kind of a funky way of doing it where I'm programmatically adding the button. But the great thing about it is that you can add buttons to anything you want. And guys, it's going to happen where you want to add things programmatically. Sometimes you can't fit everything into something that looks like in a UI, right? And you'll be learning more about programmatic views, I'm hoping, in your advanced course, right? Because I don't think you learned about it this semester, yeah? So hopefully in next semester, they'll talk about programmatic views, okay? Because you need to learn something about that. You need to learn how to draw and how to do different things inside of your user interface to make it more interesting. I mean, again, you can do that on your own, but it's nice to know how to do it. So that's all I did. I did this because I wasn't sure you're going to get anything like that this semester, and I wanted to be the first one to show you stuff like this before your other teacher did. Okay? So that's all I did. The only difference is just this really funky button thing. Okay? However, when it comes to the code to log in is very small. Here it is. When the login button is pressed, right, I get the username from the username text field and the password from the password text field. I store those in variables. I do that. I create the DB to Firebase Firestore, right? Then I get a document reference. Remember, we have to get a document reference. It's called docref here. It's a standard, right? And we're going to say db.collection usernames. The document is a username. I want to get the reference to the document that matches the username. Now, if I don't have an error, right, if the user exists, then I'm going to use authentication. I'm going to say first check to see if the user exists. If there's no error, then authenticate. Otherwise, the user's not found down here. This is where the user's not found, down in here, right? So this first if let up here is checking to see if the document exists, if the user exists, right? If the user does not exist, right, then we don't care. And I get the user information from the database. So I'm saying something like, hey, get the document reference. And what we're saying is this document reference is related to the username, right? So I look at the username, and then basically I'm saying something like, well, data is document.data, and then let email is the data email, where the email property, I'm setting it in there as email. If the email exists, we have no errors. Then if it doesn't exist, if we can't do this line, that's why it's an if-let. It's kind of like a try-catch, right, in some ways. Apple has these built-in try-catches, if-let and guard-let and all this kind of stuff, right? If-let, what it does is basically say, check to see if you can do this, right? And if you can't, then do the else, which is like a try-catch, okay? And it's going to try and get the email address from the database. If it doesn't, it's going to say, well, the user's not found. Let's display a little message that says the user's not found, okay? If we can get the data, now the next error that can happen is if the password is wrong, right? So we got the username, right, but the password doesn't compute. And now we're going to do the authentication piece. We're going to say, hey, sign in with email, and the password is password. So I'm still doing email password authentication, but I'm getting the email address related to the username from my Firestore. This is my workaround, okay? So pretty simple. Okay, and then of course we made a display error message, very similar to what we've seen before, and let's try it out. So let's see how it first fails. So I already have a user. I'm going to put in, Thomas, but instead of putting in the whole password, I forgot 3 letters or 3 characters. You can see here I only put in 123, right? And I'm going to click login, and it should pop up with an error message. Hey, error, sorry, it's no good, right? But if I put in, and by the way, here for you, not for everybody, for you, it tells you login failed, the password is invalid, or the user does not have a password. One of the two, right? But if I put in the right password, it kind of clears that up. That's one thing I did as well. I cleared it up. And if I say something like, okay, Thomas, and I put in my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then I log in, it should immediately work, right? User logged in successfully and show me everything. And then from here, we can do all the rest of the regular things that we did before. Nothing has changed there. What about registration? How does that work? Well, let's register another password. Let's register like, my brother, Joe Smith, right? Joe Smith. I'm making it up. There is no Joe Smith. And I'll say joe.smith@example.com. By the way, this doesn't do email validation. In a real life example, you'd want to do email validation before you actually register, finish registration. And it would kind of sit there and say, you've registered, now go back and log in, right? And we verified your email, you can log in now, right? And if someone tried to log in without verification, it would give another message up to the user, which is real, which is like, please verify your email, right? That's the error that it would give you. You can create that. That's an okay message to give people. You're good, we got everything, but you haven't verified yourself. Please do that, then come back, right? My username is going to be, Joe, right? And my password is still going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Look what it says here. It's giving me some stuff here. It says the password is invalid or whatever, and then it says MDEV, autofill cannot show automatic strong passwords for app bundle, due to an error. iCloud keychain is disabled because I haven't enabled that feature. So you could basically say something like, it can come up and say, no, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is not really secure. It's too terrible. It's a terrible password, right? But for us,
and it's right.
yeah. But for us, by the way, people use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? If they can get away with it. But for us, it's okay because we're going to use it. I'm going to go here and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, here's something where I've already done it for the registration, for the login form. You could take that same border highlighting and apply it to the registration form if you really wanted to, right? Where the registration form uses those blue borders to show you your user, give user feedback, well, this is what I'm doing. And the same thing goes with the border highlighting for your credit part, where that border highlighting is something that you're going to put in. Why am I talking about border highlighting? Why do I really care about it? I'm on. What? Huh?
User experience.
Yeah, okay, but why am I really talking about it?
IS-12.
No, because this is one of the random things that you might be asked to do next week.
Not IS-12 assignment for it.
Exam, midterm test, the final test, right? Which is basically saying like, hey, what if I gave you this little stupid thing to do? Well, here, I'm just giving you an example of how to do it, right? Okay, moving on. Those are for people who are watching this video, who are, Okay, so let's register this guy. Let's see if it registers. So registration is good. It says document successfully written. Let's check up on here, and you can see that we have Joe. There's Joe, right? Joe Smith. There's Thomas, right? Tom Smith. And let's look at Firestore. Firestore is also going to give you, authentication. Let's look at authentication. Authentication is going to give you two users as well, Joe Smith and Tom Smith. There's a UID, and password is secure. You have no idea what that is. Okay? Seamless, nice and easy, good workaround, and okay for you, right? You are storing double the information, but it does what we need it to do for us not using a separate interface. It gives the user experience I want, right? By the way, think about this. You can do anything like this you want. You want to use phone number as your authentication method? They don't need to know. Map phone number to user, and all of a sudden you're good to go, right? It's still username and password. You don't care about the password, right? You care about the phone number, right? There's lots of stuff you can do like this, right? It's pretty, interesting. The other way to do it is what we did earlier. I was going to mention this one more time. The API authentication method with a microservice is totally fine as well, where you make your own authentication method with your own backend, right? That is totally up to you if you want to do that, as opposed to something like this, okay? I just find that this is way more secure than you can possibly make on your own. Chances are. Okay, so that is proving out that this works, and we've proved out how you can't log in and so on, and those kind of things. I think it's pretty good, guys, and this is kind of the end of our in-class exercise 12. I've kind of shown you everything, right? Any questions around my expectations for the iOS version? I don't think it's that difficult to put together, especially since you've got examples of your view controllers here. You just need to go back, copy your project from last week, and add my view controllers, and that's really it. I mean, it's really that simple, right?
I think you missed where that mapping username.
Sure. So
I don't have the usernames thing in my Firestore.
you wouldn't.
Okay.
It's gonna, if it doesn't exist, it'll create it.
Okay. So you would already run it once.
Once
before.
I ran it once.
That's fine. Okay.
Yeah, I ran it
Missed
once.
that.
So once if you've never used it before, actually it works the same way with MongoDB, right? If you if you access a collection that doesn't exist, it'll create one. Simple, right? If you did everything right, in which we have. We've done everything right here. Yes.
I didn't make it easy.
Yes.
So I'm going to try that.
You have to do the Android side. That's your point. That's your mission for this in-class exercise 12 is to do the Android side, right? That's the other half. That's the other 2%. 2% is just following along with what we just did. The other 2% is you doing the Android side and making sure it works, okay? But again, the Android side is going to be ChatGPT. How do we do this? Here's what I have on this side. How do I do it on the Android side? And it shouldn't be that difficult to do. There's something else I want to mention about ChatGPT. If you do buy the advanced version, which I highly recommend you do, right, for $20 a month, especially if you're students, right? Even for now, it gives you plugins. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed plugins with ChatGPT because there's a plugin for GitHub. It's a plugin for GitHub with the advanced version, right? You get access to GPT-4, right, which is better than GPT-3. And this is where the plugin works at. By the way, it also works on your phone. If you download the GPT app for your phone, ChatGPT, and you pay for it and you log in with the same credentials, you have access to it on your phone as well. My wife loves it, okay? And the reason why she loves it is because all the plugins work as well. Example, if you're doing any kind of research, there's a whole research plugin. I want to search PDFs. It'll read an entire PDF for me, no problem, right? So I don't have to do any of that. And it'll summarize the entire PDF for me. I can't tell you how invaluable that is when it comes to actually looking at stuff and going through, not because you want to use ChatGPT to write something for you, but rather you want to use it so that it can vet it for you and say, here's a kind of like a summary. Instead of me having to skim through the entire document and look at it, I can literally get in 5 seconds, right? Kind of like a summary of what this thing is about. If you don't have that, and if you're doing any kind of research, we digress, but let's talk about this. There is something called Chat PDF. So if you go to chatpdf.com, it'll actually allow you to drag and drop a PDF in here. You can do up to 3 a day, right? And it will do the exact same thing, where you can drag and drop a PDF and it'll do a summary of anything you've read. Okay? So there's other ones out there too. There's Chat PDF. There's a bunch of them out there. And I can't tell you how many plugins there are already for ChatGPT. There are a ton of plugins. I'm talking like hundreds already. And it covers everything from how to write properly, it outputs things for you. Like it does a bunch of stuff. There's a ton of things and more are coming every day. Best thing for you guys to do one day is write your own plugin. That'd be great. Good bragging rights for a ChatGPT plugin, right? Anyway, questions around in-class exercise 12. So again, just to reiterate, your job is to do 2 pieces. The in-class exercise 12 part that I've shown you, the iOS side, that's easy because I've already given you the code. Your code is, you're going to be the Android side. Now, what if you didn't do in-class exercise 11? Then start now with the Android side and you can still perfect on in-class exercise 12. You don't need to do the Android side for last week to do this week. You don't have to even do last week's in-class exercise 11 to do this one, right? Start with this one. It's okay, right? If you didn't do it somehow. But please try and do one Android one. It's really important to do because you can get bonuses on your assignment. Assignment 4 is this, right? For the most part, minus some things that you have to add on your own because it's your own data set, right? Which just really is one thing that's different, just your poster link. And your user interface is going to be slightly different because you want to show your poster, right? Any other questions? Yeah.
I have one question. So like in this one, we didn't have the usernames collection, but it created one when we created
Yes.
a new user.
Yeah.
And like when we were doing for the movies, we had to create it manually on the Firestore, and then we entered like one.
The only reason why I did that, you didn't really have to. The reason why I did it, it would have created your movies collection as well last week, even if you didn't have one. But because we preloaded all of our movies up there to do some testing, that's why it created that first, right? Otherwise, realistically, we could have just said, well, let's make movies from the beginning. We could have made 10 of them using and testing the app. I don't have that time when I'm teaching to do it because it takes time to make all those things. Look it up, write data, and then I'll have all the app. Because the app itself should do the testing for us, right? But yeah, that's why I did that. Okay, but yeah, it'll create if you're doing it for the first time and the collection doesn't exist, it'll create it for you. Yeah, it's super. It's in yours work too, right? Super easy. Yeah, it's like really dumb easy, right? And honestly, now it begs the question, and this is what I'll leave you with: why would I make an API with Firebase? You can do it. You can make a whole API, like an Express API on the back end with Firebase instead of Mongo. Why? Why would I do that? Customization is the answer. You want to customize what goes to the user. Example, we've done a collection here on the front end, and the collection on the front end that we're using is with email and password, username and password, but on the back end, it's email and password, or some other things, right? Well, if we make our own custom API to do all that stuff, right, we can hide all that information. We can hide the implementation information from the app. The API will have it, and actually it'll become more secure in many ways, right? Especially if we have a lot of other things that we don't want to show up front. Our API is our gatekeeper for everything we put inside of our app. So our app is going to reflect whatever we want for the API to look like, right? Especially when, and here's the beautiful thing, I have multiple apps that use the same backend. Now, why would I have multiple apps that use the same back end? I want to release the same app and spin it in different ways in India. Okay, this is a real thing, real use case. Remember, apps need to be approved by Apple developers somewhere, right? I want to have the exact same app with a different user interface, a different front end, different colors, but I want to use the exact same back end, right, a bunch of times, API, right? This way I'm not copying the code and all that kind of stuff, and the front end doesn't matter, the back end is what matters. And then I can have a lot of different API, kind of endpoints that I can control on the back end, as well as the front end. The other thing is, what if I wanted to use an API call like we did over the last couple weeks and not worry about the Firebase? I don't want to install Firebase anything. I don't want to install Firebase in my Android app or my iOS app anywhere. I want to do all that back end stuff on the back end, and my front end doesn't have to know about Firebase at all. It just needs to know about API stuff. That's built into Foundation, right? That's another reason to do it. So there's always different reasons to do this. I'm just showing you how the most common use case, which is Firebase right in the app itself, directly in, right, as opposed to having any back end whatsoever. All right, so that's it for today, guys. Any questions before we end for today? I know we're ending off a little bit early compared to normal. It's 5:40, so we got this done early. Remember that, I'm just going to switch out of this. Remember that we've kind of accomplished what we want to do for this semester in terms of our goals. So in the second half, it was all around remote data. The first half was all about local data, right? So as this is our last lecture, for the people that are here, thank you for being here. I appreciate it. You guys are the light of my day, that's for sure, because without you, I'd be talking to a black screen, right? So really appreciate it, especially the people online that showed up today and other days as well. Thank you. And again, I'll be seeing you guys next week, but only briefly during our meeting times for your final test, okay? So if you need to meet with me between now and next week, please book some time. That's the only way it's going to work. Okay, random bookings with me for the next couple of weeks is going to be tough. All your marks should be in next week, and your final grade should be up on Banner by the 24th. I think that's the last day that all your professors will have to have your marks in. All right, so make sure you connect with your professor if you have a problem, whoever they are. Okay? And that's it for me. Questions before we go for the day? Thank you so much again, guys, and hopefully we'll see you on the other side. Thank you.
Hopefully see you next semester.
Take care.